Okay, I promise this is the last part of this. Um, After the Boston Massacre, another important event that took place was an attack on a British ship which had run aground uh, by accident, and it was basically once it ran aground, which means it no longer, it was stuck on the shore, basically. It was looted, it was burned. The British officers on board were many of them were shot and injured. At least some of them were killed, but the most important one, the commander, was injured. This made the British really angry. That was in 1772. And it's named after the ship. It's the Gaspé. That was the name of the ship. The Gaspé was a merchant ship, and it was called the Gaspé Affair. An affair being a thing that happens, an event. So, along about the same time in 1772, we also had the colonists really starting to get organized. They created what were called committees of correspondence. It sounds innocent, but it wasn't. The committees of correspondence were essentially spy networks that would collect and send news back and forth up and down the colonies so that everyone knew what was going on throughout the colonies. And basically, there were guys on horseback who would ride from one place to the next and pass the news along down this network of basically like Pony Express riders. I don't know if you've heard about the Pony Express in the Old West, where the mail was carried by these riders who would jump on a horse and ride for 25 miles and then go to the next guy and give him. It was like a relay race, but instead of passing a baton, you pass the mail. But these committees of correspondence were set up. I forgot my N. Correspondence. The committees of correspondence were set up in order to avoid the British knowing what plans were being made by the colonists. Then it was the last straw. On May 10th of 1773, we had the new tax on tea. We previously had sugar, we had stamp. Both of those were repealed, by the way, because of the pressure by the colonists. Now the British finally, they said, okay, well, still got to get a little bit of tax out of these colonists. We don't want to make them so mad that they're really mad. So let's just put a little tax on tea. Well, it turns out that little tax on tea was like, what the expression is, the idiomatic expression is the straw that broke the camel's back. If you think of a camel and you're putting straw on its back, eventually you're going to put one little straw on its back that's going to be more than the poor camel can carry, and back is going to break under the weight. Well, that's exactly what happened here. This tea tax was a very, very small tax on tea, much less tax on tea than you pay when you go buy tea at HEB. But it was enough to start the war. You remember that as a result of the tea tax, certain very rich, very influential Boston merchants, and I use the word merchant sort of loosely because really they were smugglers who didn't want to pay the tea tax. They wanted to get tea into the colonies without paying that tax. Most significant among them was John Hancock. And John Hancock and the Sons of Liberty created that little incident which we saw the Liberty's kids on about the Boston Tea Party. Now, to me, it was a bit of an overreaction. I mean, good grief, you put a relatively small tax on tea. Yeah, it's a burden, but is it worth going to war for? I guess the people then thought it was. We were always told in school that the reason why people were so mad is because they were taxed without having representatives in the Parliament in England. But that's really kind of a dumb argument because the truth is, had the colonies had representation in the Parliament, the Tea Act would have passed anyway. In fact, the British at about this point were hearing all these people saying, no taxation without representation, blah, blah, blah. And so they were actually trying to get an agreement to let the colonies have representation. But at that point, the colonies were having nothing of it. They decided, we're fed up. Sorry. Unfortunately, after the Boston Tea Party, the British passed another act which was called the Port of Boston Act. That was its official name. But the colonists called it the Intolerable Act. Something that's intolerable is something that you can't stand. It's like so horrible you can't put up with it. Now, the Port of Boston Act said the entire city of Boston was closed for ship traffic. You couldn't bring ships in or out of Boston Harbor. The British set up a naval barricade of ships so that no one could get in, no one could get out. That made war inevitable. At this point, it was pretty much set in stone that there was going to be a war. Violence got more and more in the colonies. The Sons of Liberty were doing more activity. And one really important thing that happened during this time was Thomas Paine wrote that little book that I showed you that is above my desk in the classroom, which is called Common Sense. And Common Sense was, by the standard of the colonial times, a very easy thing to read. It was something that everybody read. And as a result of that, little book and the arguments that Thomas Paine made in it, in which he said that the colonies have no choice but to separate from England, the mood of the country, or the mood of the colonies, changed, and people started to think that freedom was really the way to go, that they really wanted to separate from England and create their own country. Now, I must stress, the majority of people in the colonies still wanted to live peacefully and continue to be part of England. But a large minority was pushing for war. In 1774, in September of 1774, we had the First Continental Congress. Representatives from all the states, or all the colonies except Georgia, showed up in Philadelphia to discuss what are we going to do. And what they did was they decided that we had to start preparing for war. They agreed that George Washington would be the leader. They agreed to start gathering up arms and doing other things like that, and that they were going to manage the war. Well, sure enough, 1775 comes along, and you have the British hear about a large supply of guns in a place called Lexington, Massachusetts. They march to Lexington from Boston. And remember, this is the famous midnight ride of Paul Revere, where he went through the countryside telling everyone the British are coming, the British are coming. So the Americans found out that the British were coming up to Lexington, and they set up defenses there in Lexington, but the defenses were very weak. I mean, the British Army was the strongest army in the world. So here's what happens. Americans get killed. The British try to find the weapons. Oops, there are no weapons. So they move on to Concord. And at Concord, they find a lot of Americans waiting for them. The Minutemen, the guys who were ready to fight in a minute, grabbing their guns off above their fireplaces and running out to fight the British. This is when that happened. And the Minutemen defeat the British at Concord and send them back to Boston, and many, many, many British were killed, and that is when the war started. The first shot at the Battle of Lexington was called the shot that was heard around the world, and the reason was it was the first time that people, regular ordinary people, rebelled against their king, and ultimately succeeded. I'm sure if we'd lost the American Revolution, nobody would call it the shot that was heard around the world. But since we won, oh, by the way, that's not merch, it's March. We call it that. Okay, so the war goes on. Battle of Lexington, Concord. Then we have the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga, which was when the Green Mountain Boys and that famous person, Benedict Arnold, took the British fort at Ticonderoga, confiscated its cannons, which was really important in those days. That same day that Benedict Arnold and the Green Mountain Boys took Fort Ticonderoga from the British was the day the Second Continental Congress met. Actually, I misspoke before. It was during the Second Continental Congress George Washington was made the head of the Army. And ultimately it was the Second Continental Congress that decided to declare independence in 1776. You remember July 4th, 1776 is Independence Day. In 1775, a famous battle took place in Boston in which the Americans lost, but the British suffered a lot of casualties. It's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. Really, it wasn't fought mostly on Bunker Hill. It was fought on a hill next door, which is called Breed's Hill, but we all know it as the Battle of Bunker Hill. And that was the first in a long line of defeats for the Americans. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, there was the Battle of Long Island, which George Washington was almost completely destroyed there. He got out by the skin of his teeth, thanks to a heavy fog and friendly people who took him out across the water by boat, and the British general who wanted to do the gentlemanly thing and not annihilate his enemy when he had them cornered. Washington and his troops escaped to Manhattan, and they went up through Manhattan, running away from the British all the way along. There's the Battle of Princeton, the Battle of Brandywine, the Battle of Saratoga. Those are, who cares? A lot of battles. What's the next important thing is in 1778, America finally makes alliance become allies. So they ally with each other, which means they made an agreement to fight together against the British, which makes sense because the French hate the British. Anyway, there were a bunch more battles. Then in 81, we have the Battle of Yorktown, which everybody says was the last battle of the war. And you remember that George Washington used some excellent strategy to get the British to get themselves isolated on the peninsula of Yorktown, where they were surrounded by water and couldn't escape by water because, guess what? The French fleet was right off the shore. And the British cut off from the British Navy. The British Army was cut off from the British Navy. They had no way to retreat, no way to get new supplies, and they gave up. And that was the end of the war. Actually, there were some battles after Yorktown, but who's counting? The next major event, and this is the last thing I have to say, is on September 3rd of 1783. You had the Second Treaty of Paris. Ending the American Revolution. America was now free and independent.